All right, so now we're going to talk about guitars. I'm going to talk about the guitars using this mix as my example, but not everything that I discuss in this little segment is going to be specific to this particular record because there's a very wide variety out in the world of guitars and really in everything, and this mix can only account for so much of that. So let's play this example and then talk about it. So anytime I'm working with a rock record or anything that has guitars in it, the first thing that I'm thinking is, what is the guitar line playing off of? And in this particular case, to me, musically, if I take the guitar out, it becomes very apparent what it's musically representing. The electric guitar here that I brought in is clearly bridging the space between the dobro and the bass. The dobro and the bass are basically doing the same thing. They're complementing the same melodic concept, and this guitar is also doing that. So this guitar musically is kind of filling in the connection between the dobro and the bass. So when I pan it, there's two ways to consider the panning situation. I could pan them apart and create sort of a wider version of the melodic movement, which in a pop record is usually going to be my approach. In a rock record, especially being that I have the acoustic guitar off on the right that's doing something slightly different, I actually want to pan the electric into the position with the dobro and use it as a gluing element. So I think of the dobro and the electric as part of one idea and use the pan position to glue that idea and cement that idea together. And in this specific case, it happens to be sitting right between, pan-wise, the dobro and the bass. And if I flip on this other guitar, you hear that the more staccato rhythm and separated notes are actually kind of mirroring what the acoustic guitar is doing, and so it's sort of meant to support the melodic movement that's happening with the acoustic. They're all part of the same basic melodic movement, but rhythmically, structurally speaking, they're very different. So in my mind, the intention here is that the electric guitar goes with the dobro and connects it to the bass, and the second electric guitar, the more rhythmic electric guitar, complements the acoustic guitar, reinforces what the acoustic guitar is doing, and connects that to the bass. And so I have them panned in positions that help those ideas come together. Make sense? So now to get to the processing side of it. So this electric guitar sounds like an electric guitar that is naturally of a brighter timbre, but for whatever reason has been recorded in either a little bit dark or perhaps it was tuned down or something like that, because it's sitting a little bit dark and a little bit dull in the mix. So I have to ask myself an artistic question right off the bat, and this is super important for guitars, because guitars tend to be tracked very intentionally. So I have to ask, is this guitar supposed to run together with the record? Is it supposed to sort of glue and be masked or mask the dobro and bass a little bit? Is that the intention of the idea, or is it supposed to separate and stand out? And I think the case can be made for either. In this particular case, my inclination is to separate it and create a bigger sound, because if I can put the dobro, which is very mid-rangey, you know, it's got a lot of that like 700, 800 hertz kind of focused energy, if I can put the electric guitar above that, it's going to create a taller and bigger sounding record. So I can use this electric guitar for bigness and think of it that way. And to do that, I want to create some separation. However, if there was another guitar part on top of this, something that was higher up and brighter, then maybe I would actually think of this electric guitar as a gluing agent, something that can be a little bit in the background, something that can just be there to kind of fill it in and make the sound fuller. So it stylistically really depends on what's in the arrangement and how we choose to interpret that. Being that we don't have a brighter part, I'm going to show a couple of different ways that we can get that brightness. And the first one is going to be, obviously, EQ. So, before. there's pros and cons to doing this. In a certain way, I haven't really changed the fundamental idea of what the sound is by making it brighter in the way that I have. However, certain things have happened now. It's a little bit edgier and it's a little bit grabbier, so to speak, and that might not be appropriate, or it might be appropriate. I kind of like the fact that it's become a little grabbier. I don't think that the original idea was to think of this electric guitar as a lead, but I think it's such a dense sound, and it's played very nicely, that putting it on par with the dobro or having it up to level with the dobro is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm going to show you another way to do it, though, real quick. So you'll hear the same change sort of just occurred, but now I want to compare the EQ'd version to the Melodyne version and then break down sonically what the differences are and what I did. So if you hear that, your immediate thought should be, okay, those kind of do the same thing, but they have a different textural sound. And on top of that, with the EQ, a bit of the guitar disappears. Some of the guitar goes away and another part of the guitar comes forward. With the Melodyne version, the entirety of the guitar is still there. And here's what's going on. I'm using Melodyne and doing something called formant shifting. Formant shifting restructures the harmonic alignment, and effectively what I'm doing here is playing up the brighter harmonics. It was as if the guitar itself had been tuned to a higher tension, and therefore to a higher note base. So let me give you that in solo real quick. It's like the whole timbre of the guitar has changed. So I'm going to go between the EQ and the Melodyne version real quick in solo mode, because you'll be able to pick out some more nuanced differences. It's kind of cool. It's like the entirety of the guitar is still there. I haven't done anything. I haven't taken it away. And even if I level match a little bit more, it's like I've changed the guitar. It's different now. It's like a new instrument. And I think that there's some cool uses for this. I mean, sometimes EQ is going to be better. Sometimes the formant shifting technique might be better, but it's as if I've changed a fundamental part of the production, which is kind of cool that we can do that in post these days. Some examples of that might be, let's say we were working on like a darker kind of like grungier rock type tune, and we wanted that quintessential like drop D kind of structuring to the harmonic. We could formant shift down and get that. Or conversely, let's say that the tuning of a guitar was changed for the sake of the playability, but the actual tone of the guitar would have sounded better had it not been. We can basically retune the tuning structure of the guitar. And some other places where this is cool is like, let's say a piano track has been recorded and the recording was done on something like a Yamaha C7, but ideally it would have been done on something like a Bosendorfer or one of those bigger, darker grand pianos. We can use formant shifting to help us get there and get something more similar. Conversely, certain styles of pop music, like if it's something that's calling upon that kind of Elton John brighter 80s pop type of thing where a lot of it was done on a baby grand, but not too many studios have like $100,000 baby grands. You know, if you're on a regular grand piano like a Steinway or something, which is going to be much warmer, you can formant shift it you can form and shift it up, and it's going to sound more like a baby grand piano. It would be as if a baby grand had been recorded itself. And so there's a lot of really cool production-minded things that we can do with this style of treatment. Now, the other thing that's really, really cool about this, and it's kind of hard to demonstrate, but one thing that you can do in Melodyne is right under Settings, it says Save as MIDI. And if you click that, it actually exports a MIDI file of all of the notes that it's recorded and heard. And one of the things you can do with this that's really cool, one of the ways that I use it in my mixing is, let's say your bass guitar is just thin, or it doesn't have the substance that you really want from it. You can MIDI map the bass, and you can then bring the MIDI information in and have that MIDI control either an outboard synth or a soft synth that has a bass patch hooked up to it, and get a synth bass to play along effectively with the lead bass. And you can do this with more or less anything. I believe I'll be demonstrating this. I haven't set it up yet, but I'm going to try and demonstrate this on the vocals, something similar to that idea. To me, just doing this formant shifting, I think that the guitar fits very nicely into the track. I feel like I can actually back it off a little bit, to be honest, if I want. I kind of liked it up, actually. Let's bring in the rhythm. So I like the tone of the rhythm. I think it's maybe, there's just a little bit too much, maybe around the like 300, 400 range, just earballing it here. Earballing. Pull up an EQ real quick. So was it 250 hertz? So yeah, there was something in there where it just felt like there was what I call an unnecessary tone. When I take it out within the mix, I don't hear too much change to the actual guitar, but everything else just becomes a little bit clearer. And usually it doesn't take much. Like I'm using like a medium Q and doing about 3 dB. Well, it looks like exactly 3 dB on this particular EQ. So I mean that's just very utilitarian kind of an EQ type thing. Now I'm thinking that this can be backed off. Now, one thing to note about these guitars is that they're pretty dry. They're close captures of cabs. And so I do have these artificial rooms that were sent with them. The producer of the record, he likes the Ocean Way room returns, so he did send those. In this particular case, while they do sound very good, contextually, I didn't think that they were all that great, so I would almost prefer to just slap on something like a Deverb plugin or something like that to kind of seat things in. Now, when I'm doing guitar work, a lot of the times I will choose mono reverbs, and the reasoning for that is because when you have a stereo reverb return, you end up getting a cloud of stereo information, and so if you have multiple things that are going to multiple stereo returns, you end up with this sort of glom of stereo reverb, and it's not very separate reverb. It all kind of runs together, and ultimately what that does is contract the perceived width of the record. So if I want really wide guitars, or if I just generally want a clearer phantom center image or a wider image in general, using a mono return a lot of the times is the better way to go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just throw it on as an insert. Normally, I would just do this as a send, which is the standard choice, but for the sake of moving things along, I'm just going to run it as an insert. And a lot of the times, I do this anyway because the guitar tracks will oftentimes have a spring reverb recording or some kind of like digital plate recording in the signal chain going up to the cab. So I'm not unused to getting guitars that already have reverb printed into them. So when I do this as an insert, it changes the level, and actually the impulse is to immediately try and level match, but I don't think that that's actually the best way to do it. I think the best way to do it is to then reset the level to where it feels right once the reverb is there, because the presence of the reverb will change the perceived presence of the guitar, and in fact, we might not need as much level from the guitar once the reverb's in. So the guitar sounds a little bit too wet at the moment. I'm going to turn down the wet-dry ratio just a little bit. I think part of that is because the decay is a little bit long, so I'm going to shorten the decay a bit. And I think that the pre-delay is still a little bit short, so I'm going to stretch that out some too. And that made a pretty big difference, I think. The guitar immediately popped forward, but it still retains that sense of reverberant quality and filling up the mix and a little bit of glow. And actually, I honestly use Deverb fairly often on mixes for these purposes. I think it's a legit good reverb, and it's just the stock reverb plugin. It just works for this kind of a purpose. I'm just going to copy and paste it right over to the other guitar and see if that feels right. I think I can turn the left guitar down a touch. Now, my other consideration at this point would be if texturally I would want to put compression onto a guitar. And compressing guitars is one of those things where it feels counterintuitive, because a guitar going through a chain like this, like, it's already clearly very compressed. Like, the dynamic range is very sustainy on these guitars. You can see it in the waveform, you can hear it, it's pretty clear, like, you know, all the distortion pedals and everything like that, they compress the signal. But you can use a compressor for tone, and you can use it to create a textural feel that might not be so apparent right away. So I'm going to use the finality, and I'll show you what I mean. So I take off the auto gain feature. This is actually a limiter, but it has a really, really nice character and some really cool character controls. And so if I throw it into soft mode, before, after. You can hear that bit of extra tension on it, and you can also hear it kind of clamps on the low end, and it sort of starts to move the tone in a way to, like, it doesn't add upper mid-range, but it seems to emphasize the feel of the upper mid-range. It's hard to describe. But anyway, I can play with a few of these controls. I can switch over to aggro, see how that feels. And you can hear that really pulls up that sort of upper mid-range sensibility that I was talking about. Like, it just seems to force it more into that, like, 2K, 3K zone. And for a guitar, that can be really cool. And the personality of the compressor that you choose to use will highly influence how the compressor makes it feel. So I'm going to adjust some output gain to kind of level match it. And then I'll pull it into the mix here, and you'll hear the difference before and after. It feels like it cuts more, it has more edge to it. It's kind of a cool thing. And I'm just going to pull these settings right on over to my other one right here, throw that reverb back on. Cool. So there are some ideas on processing these guitars. And guitars, generally speaking, don't usually take a whole ton of finagling to get right. Obviously, I've done some sound designy stuff here, but usually most of the time, guitars are going to come in a pretty specific way. That said, my advice is don't be afraid to get creative and to pull something in a different way, because sometimes that's what it needs. And here on my right side, I have a guitar that's almost identical to what I got. And on the left side, I have one that's very remarkably different than what I got. And I think that both of these are working in this case and will end up as the final mix prints for this particular song.